Alrighty, how we doing? Chapter 25, yay, character development and good sporting behavior. So with this lecture, with this video, rather than bore you for an hour of just me talking, I want to try to keep these pre-recorded videos under 30 minutes. So that means I'm most likely going to be skipping slides. So there's 52 slides. I don't know if you can see this number down here. That's excessive. And if you remember, these slides are coming directly from the authors, directly from the textbook. It kind of comes as a whole package. You get the textbook, you get the slides, you get the videos. And I like them because it's directly from the textbook and the verbiage and everything is coming from the textbook, but at times it can be a bit repetitive and it touches on some things that I don't find as important as other things. So that's the caveat. So my challenge would be for you to watch this and use this to your supplementation with your studying and of course with your reading. But if you need to go back and go over some of these slides that we'll be skipping, please feel free to do so. So chapter 25, character development and good sporting behavior. I'm going to be also referring directly from your textbook as always. This will be on page 585. Coming from your textbook. So if you want to follow along, that's where we'll be. So the need for psychology of character, fair play, and good sporting behavior. And so they mention morality in starting off with this chapter, and how morality is very broadly defined and how a lot of researchers, especially in sports psychology, have not come to a conclusive or definitive definition. However, they have three tenets, according to your textbook, of what makes up this morality concept. And as you can see here, it's fair play, character, and good sporting behavior. And so let's go over those, what those mean, and the importance of those. I'm going to try again to refrain from reading just word for word from some of these slides as well. It's essentially providing you a foundation of something that you can read if you want, and then you have this other voice coming in and just adding with different perspectives. So that's my goal. So defining character, once again, there is not a defining definition or a definitive definition of character, but they talk a lot about the importance of character. And so on page 588, I really like the direction of where it's going when it's talking about an individual being able to overcome obstacles, cooperate with teammates, develop self-control, and persist in the face of defeat. I really like those tenets that, according to the textbook, once again, of 588, of how they're defining character. We hear that so much in sport, especially from coaches. My players have a lot of character. When you come to this program, you'll develop good character. Well, what does that mean? And I think, you can make a lot of arguments for what it could mean and what it does not mean. But from my perspective, I think that's really important to have those tenets. Let me repeat them. Overcoming obstacles, cooperating with teammates. Doesn't mean you have to always get along with them, but you're cooperating with them. You're being respectful. Developing self-control, which I think is, in my mind, the most important part. If we don't have some sense of influence or control over emotions, psychological states, physical states, it's hard to develop, good character or effective character. And then being able to persist in the face of defeat. Love that as well. Being resilient, being gritty. And they're also throwing in their compassion and integrity. And I think, again, they're highly related to the tenets that I just went over. But being able to show compassion to oneself and to others, cooperating with teammates, and having integrity, so self-control, right? What you say you're doing, you're actually doing. When the doors are closed and nobody's watching, you have integrity. So you're not just talking and not doing. You're actually talking and actually doing it. You're living your preaching, your teaching. And most importantly, with integrity, you're doing what's right, once again, as I alluded to, in the face of defeat or dilemmas or setbacks. I think that's when human beings in general go awry and go astray, is when dilemmas, setbacks, and hardships come. Integrity tends to go out the door as well. And emotions start to take over. And this can be very innate, but this is part of emotional intelligence. This is part of self-control, is being able to integrate the skill set of integrity during the defeats, during the dilemmas, the setbacks, etc. So here are your components of morality. We just went over those. So there's character. Now fair play. And so now on page 586, it's talking about fair play. And it mentions that fair play requires that all contestants understand and adhere not only to the formal rules of the game, but also to the spirit of cooperation and unwritten rules of play necessary to ensure a fair contest. This is paramount, right, within sport. If you're going to have competition in football, basketball, soccer, fencing, there needs to be a collective agreement upon rules, upon regulations, and upon unwritten rules or regulations. So for an example, I'm thinking of baseball. One rule is the first baseman's body part, usually his foot, must be on the bag, and he must obtain the ball at the same time in order to get the runner out coming to first, right? That is a rule. That's a regulation. Everyone must abide by that rule. An unwritten rule within baseball perhaps is being respectful of batters and not beaning them every time, not throwing the ball at them every time. Now, that doesn't mean it doesn't happen. However, I think that's part of this unwritten rule, right? So you can make the argument that the unwritten rule of not throwing the ball as a pitcher at the batter is part of this unwritten rule program or culture that's in place. But also, if a player does intentionally throw the ball at a batter, that unwritten rule is also to retaliate in many cases. I'm not saying it's right, but that's just an example of some written and unwritten rules within fair play. And I mean, you could go on and on within different sports as well, but it's a salient or important concept to grasp and to know, both as a coach and as an athlete. So you have some sort of structure, so you have some sort of guide and foundation to follow, both in practice and especially in competition. Good sporting behavior, page 586, and this goes really kind of throughout it talk about it throughout the whole chapter, but starting on, especially on page 586. So they give a lot of examples, but essentially it's you're adhering to fair play even when it means you are losing or you could lose. So I think we know of examples where, if they give you some examples, wonderful examples of some tennis players. I forget the name. Bjorn Borg, I think. Bjorn Borg might be. Here we go. Patrick Rafter, sorry. Patrick Rafter was playing in the US Open. They were tied going into one of the final sets of the match. He knew that the ball went out, but the umpire, the ref, they call it umpire in tennis. I think they do. An official, sorry. The official called it in, but Patrick went back and told the official that it was out, resulting in him losing a match in the US Open. Like a huge contest, one of the most important contests in tennis. It's one of the big five or big six, right? French Open, US Open, etc. And so that concrete example is a wonderful example of continuing to show good sportsmanship or good behavior or good fair play, even when it includes you perhaps losing, or it doesn't even have to be losing, gives you some sort of disadvantage, right? A running back lost the ball, he fumbled the ball, and he got it 2 yards short of the first down, but the umps marked him ahead of the first down. A good sporting behavior would perhaps tell the refs that, in fact, I actually got it 2 yards short, so it's still third down. Something like that. I know that's a horrible example, but I think you can come up with perhaps better examples of what good sporting behavior might look like. And then on page 587, they give you good sporting behaviors that consist of different factors, or 5 factors that are ingrained within this concept. So number 1 is there's a full commitment towards participation from all parties involved. Respect and concern for rules and officials. So there we see the fair play really come into play. 3, respect and concern for social convention. So like the shaking of hands and stuff after a contest, after a match, after a game. Respect and concern for the opponent. So lending one's equipment to the opponent, agreeing to play if the opponent is late, refusing to take advantage of injured opponents, stuff like that. And then number 5, avoiding poor attitudes towards participation. So avoiding a win-at-all-cost approach, not showing temper after a mistake, emotional intelligence once again. So just some important factors of what some research has shown that makes up this phenomenon, this concept of good sporting behavior. We already went over character. And then they go over some important, they have a study, this Kids Take on Moral Issues on Sport by Moria Stewart in 2003. And it's simply being able to identify what moral issues children age 10 to 12 experienced in sport. She did a study conducted around that. And then she got some of the children's input or subjective experience based around that. So she came up or found concerns regarding this issue of moral in sport from this age group. Number 1 was the fairness of adult actions. Are adults acting fair? And we have noticed in many occasions that they do not, especially for youth sports. Many adults seem to go crazy. Number 2, negative game behaviors, so verbal intimidation by opponents, intentional fouls, etc. And then number 3, negative team behavior, so selfish teammates, dishonesty, misbehavior from other teammates. So that's one important study from this particular age group surrounding moral issues. I think we can come up with a lot of different examples, especially with that age group. That's why it's so important that coaches and adults are influencing these kids, these youth, from that certain age, because they're going to take what they learn into their proceeding years of sport, into high school, college, and if they make it professional or even college. And so it's important that we're forming those foundational behaviors to be effective, to be positive, to be moral, right? So then we get into some approaches or theories. Let's just stick with approach rather than theories. So in developing good character and good sporting behavior. And then as we also know, fair play is intertwined into this. So first they go over this social learning approach. And Albert Bandura, one very famous psychologist, talks about social learning approach. And then they relate it in the book to sport. And so number 1, in being able to socially learn and enhance one's learning experience socially, you're modeling or observing behavior or others. So you're just simply watching somebody else perform an activity or a skill set that you do as an athlete, and then you're mimicking, you're mirroring this individual. Number 2, reinforcement. So being reinforced or penalized for one's actions, something we hopefully learn from a very young age. If you do X, Y, Z, you'll experience more success, or you'll experience positive reinforcement. If you do X, Y, Z or don't do X, Y, Z, it could also be negative reinforcement. You'll be penalized and you'll receive negative reinforcement. And then number 3 is social comparison. So then you're actually getting into competition and comparing oneself to other individuals, especially as it relates to your particular skill set, position, sport, gender, age, etc. So this is a social learning approach. And then we're getting to structural development approach right here. I probably could go like this and it'd be a little bit easier. Here we go. So the structural developmental approach focuses on more of the psychology of learning and growth and development, especially through the changes of a child's thoughts and judgments, okay? And then it gets at the underlying behavior that interacts with the environment, that experiences or shapes moral reasoning. So then it gets into the importance of morality and being able to reason morally. So moral reasoning is just trying to figure out what's good and bad, according to you, whether it's religious or not. I know we use a lot of morality terms and words within religion, but it's not always related to religion. Whatever you believe is right or wrong, you're reasoning it in your mind. Moral development is the actual process of getting those reasonings, the rights and the wrongs, and figuring out a system or a plan of what you could do potentially in this type of situation, whatever situation that might be, to affect it morally for yourself and for those that you're surrounding. And then moral behavior is actually doing it. So we're thinking it, we're developing a plan, and then actually behaviorally acting it, behaving it. So these steps are within structural developmental approach. One of the key points that I want to talk about within your book, and this is coming off of page 590. I love these key points within your book because it's such a wonderful little summation of what should you take away from that certain section. So I highly recommend that if you're not reading the whole book, at least read the key points because they're really helpful. So on page 590 in relation to structural development approach and moral reasoning, development, and behavior, it mentions all of these different things. So moral reasoning is a decision process. Moral development is the process of experience of growth through which the person develops the capacity to reason morally. So developing that plan. Moral behavior is the execution of the plan and the reasoning. So there's your steps. Moral reasoning and behavior depend on individuals' level of cognitive development. So it's hard for younger people, as you might guess, to morally reason. It really comes into play. They mention in your book around 7 and 8 years old. I know it's not very, very old, but that's when you start to develop some of these cognitive processes to reason and behave morally. And then it should really come about or really start to materialize in late adolescence, 17, 18, and it will continue to develop as well throughout your adult life. So then the third approach that they talk about is the social psychological approach. So now it's simply bringing the social learning approach, so this social modeling reinforcement comparison that we talked about in the first one, and the structural development approach, so this morally approach into one big approach, social psychological approach. And the one thing I wanted to touch on within this, within the social psychological approach and the importance of it, is the necessity of cultural attitudes and values and beliefs within the culture or the program organization that one is residing in. So they touch on this issue a lot throughout your book, and it's an issue because it tends to be an issue in actual sport cultures. Developing character via sport, which, as we know, hopefully from your reading, isn't accurate. Doesn't mean it's false, it just isn't accurate. Sport by itself isn't going to develop character, isn't going to instill moral values or beliefs. It's the culture, it's the coaches, the leaders, the administration that will enforce these character building attributes or these moral values and beliefs. And so the individuals leading the sport, leading the program, will facilitate or inform one's character building traits or moral reasoning or good sporting behavior traits. And that's something that's very important, again, that they touch on throughout this chapter, is that issue. That sport by itself isn't accurately going to build one's character, isn't good for one's character. It's those that are leading them within that sport, the leaders, the coaches. And I guarantee you a lot of people can come up with wonderful examples of this. I have had coaches that have been wonderful individuals that I've learned from, that I've wanted to take into my own life, some of the attributes and traits that they taught me. However, I've also had coaches, especially in football, that have been very degrading and immature and horrible in terms of verbiage and language used and attitudes and behaviors and emotions utilized. How is that going to help build my character for the good? It's going to do the opposite, right? So there's just some examples of that. Now, moving on, measuring good sporting behavior, this is on page 592, just a survey, a scale that allows researchers essentially to measure this good sporting behavior. It's very subjective, as we might guess. And then on page 593, understanding the connection between moral reasoning and moral behavior. I don't want to touch on all that. There we go. They touch on the 4 stages of moral action in the moral reasoning behavior link. And this is coming from Shields, Rest, Miller, and Bredemeyer, in making, once again, the connection between moral reasoning and moral behavior. And I believe we have these 4. Here we go. Bam. So the stages of moral action. We've already gone over some of the stages within different approaches. Now, connecting moral reasoning and moral behavior. What does that actually look like? So we see moral reasoning, moral development, and motor behavior. What are some of the connecting factors that allows for this approach to take place? So number 1 is being able to interpret the situation. Number 2 is deciding the best course of moral action. There's that cognitive processes. And then making a choice to actually act. And then implementing actually a moral response. And so it's very similar, once again, to this structural developmental approach. Just a different example of what it might look like in application. Stages of moral action. And then it starts to touch on, in your book on 593, of hazing and bullying in sport, which I think is fascinating, not in a good way, but in an interesting way, because it happens in sport. Many of you probably watching this, especially those that have been athletes, especially at the college level, have experienced this. So hazing is any activity expected of someone joining a group that humiliates, degrades, abuses, or endangers the person in some form. The person in many the person being hazed, when it comes to hazing in sport, in many instances are voluntarily taking part. Not always, I realize that. A lot of people don't want to be hazed. However, they recognize, it's part of the culture. It's part of what happens here. It's tradition, right? And so they mentioned that there's 3 types of hazing according to research: physical, psychological, and alcohol-related, which I would argue the alcohol-related is physical and psychological. But you can probably come up with numerous examples that have been either personally experienced or that you read about that includes some sort of physical hazing. You have to dress up like the opposite gender and walk around school. Psychological hazing, I don't want to come up with examples because I know that some of these will be so bad. You have to get up there and recite a song or sing a song in front of the whole team. Something along those lines. And then alcohol related, you can come up with numerous examples. You have to drink X amount of beers or alcohol in order to be on the team or be in the culture. I don't know. they noticed within your book, or they talk about within your book, the importance of being able to include tradition within a culture, especially for new incomers, but not to bring it to the level to where it's humiliating, degrading, abusing, or endangering other individuals, especially psychologically, physically, or alcohol related. I think it's very important to have certain traditions that one must do to be in the group, to be in the culture. But I also think that hazing is a very ineffective way to do that. Why? Because especially for those coming into the group, it places them in a psychologically and physically dangerous position. And in many instances, it's one that perhaps they can never recover from. And if they don't do it well, whatever the hazing event might be, or if they don't get through it in some facet, think of how detrimental that can be, especially psychologically. And so figuring out tradition, but not necessarily hazing, needs to stop, right? So then they talk about bullying, and bullying in sport now is more specifically to unwanted events. So hazing, in many instances, once again, we see individuals that are being hazed voluntarily participate. Bullying, 99.99999% of the time, the people do not want to be bullied. And so it's intentional, aggressive behavior towards certain individuals or groups of people. And it continues to degrade and endanger these individuals. And once again, the individuals receiving the bullying are receiving it unwantingly. So they don't want to receive it. They're voluntarily choosing not to receive it, but they are receiving it. And it goes beyond the timeline, in my mind, of hazing. Hazing, in my mind, can last, the first week of camp, or the first year as a freshman. You have to carry the equipment onto the court or something like that. Bullying can last for much longer. Not always, but it can. And talk about psychological and physical distress and negative and detrimental effects. Bullying is it. And if hazing needs to stop, bullying really needs to stop. The importance with bullying is first recognizing that the other person receiving the bullying is a human being just like yourself. And whether you believe in a God or a Buddha or whatever, we all have emotions. We all have psychological processes. And in order to progress in life in general, we need to show love and kindness. That does not mean in a sport like football or rugby that you need to be always loving and gentle with your teammates. No. That does mean that respect falls into order. And that, in some facet, is showing love and respect, or love and gentleness. If only we could see the humanistic quality in every single individual, as a coach, as teammates, players, etc. Then I believe in seeing through that lens, bullying would stop. Pushing one to act, giving constructive criticism, wonderful, needs to continue. But when you cross the line of threats, of rumors, of attacking somebody physically, verbally, then it's just causing detriment to that individual, which then ultimately causes detriment to your team as well. So being able to combat hazing and bullying in sport, they give you some wonderful examples, starting on page 595. And they kind of go throughout. I told you 30 minutes, and so I'm going to try to hurry here. So there's some combating connections. They give you some wonderful examples of the connection between character development and physical activity. And also, so they give you some positive examples, but they also give you some negative examples or effective and ineffective examples of building character via physical activity or sport, or not building character via sport or physical activity. So on page 597, they go over some of these stages. So number one, they talk about what's called the differential association, which is right. And I'm receiving a call, so let me silence this. Let's go 5 minutes. Which is right here. Here we go. So differential association. It's talking about specifically delinquency or individuals that are delinquent or in a troubling situation in general, but under the umbrella of building character via sport or physical activity. And so differential association. They're starting to associate essentially with different groups or more effective groups. And in this case, a team or physical activity aspect. So in other words, they're getting kids off the streets. That's one awesome aspect that sport presents, especially for delinquent individuals. It allows them to go to the practice field or the court instead of being on the streets doing heaven knows what. Number two, social bonding. So instead of bonding with gang members or other delinquent individuals, it allows you to bond with a teammate, which hopefully will form positive connections, positive and effective behaviors. Number three, they call this the labeling hypothesis. This is interesting. So I'm going to read this right here. Sport does not teach values. Being labeled an athlete leads to special treatment, while being labeled delinquent leads to a negative self-fulfilling prophecy. So an example that I can think of is college football players at a major university. They have this label of, being a national champ, being All-American, going to the NFL draft. And so why should I do this assignment? Why should I do this group work when all I'm going to be doing is going to the NFL draft? Or this doesn't matter because I'll just get my degree later. And so the professor will work with me, the group will excuse me. I have this label of being an athlete, which, as we know, can be very detrimental and ineffective. So it's creating this false sense of identity or labeling yourself that then is affecting other areas of your life as well. And then number four, they call this economic strain. So delinquency occurs because many youths are impoverished but still desire the high standard of living they see in others. Sport participation or physical activity participation, however, allows impoverished youngsters to gain prestige and status, and in turn reduces the strain between their dreams of a better life and beliefs about attainable goals. And so one wonderful example, you have to get to the professional ranks, is bringing impoverished or delinquent individuals up the ranks to professionalism that will allow for economic growth, that will allow for money to be brought in to them, their families, friends, etc. So those are some connections between character development and physical activity in sport, particularly with delinquent and or troubled individuals, usually youths. I'm going to slowly start wrapping up here. The rest of the book continues to touch on sport participation and gang behaviors and the importance that sport can have potentially on inviting these individuals to get out of gangs and other delinquent behaviors. On page 599, they give you strategies for enhancing character development within sports. So that's wonderful. Some of these behaviors, especially for coaches. So being able to actually define sporting behavior. Once again, we see a lot of coaches going, hey, player Williams, have good character, focus, and be a good sport. Okay, what the heck does that mean? So being able to bring explicit definitions of what you want your teammates to live, especially when it comes to character. So if you want your players to have good character or good sporting behavior, show them and write them and tell them what that means to you. Reinforcing, encouraging sporting behaviors, modeling appropriate behaviors from others. That goes on to 601. And then towards the end of the chapter, it dives into guiding practice and character development. So now actually within practice, how can you include fair play? How can you include good sporting behavior? So hiring a ref to come in to call bad calls. How are your players going to react? Just as an example. Or being able to form other types of scenarios within practice. So when they get to competition, they actually have already practiced some of these scenarios, and it's ingrained in them when it comes to character. And then you're able to transfer some of these values, hopefully, to non-sport environments. The last thing I want to touch on is that, and I touch on this in your book, and I think it's super important. Because quote-unquote sport develops character, but as we know it, sport itself does not, we expect that sports lessons can transfer into non-sport activities like school. That is not always the case. Why is that? Because once again, coaches or staff don't make that explicit. They don't teach that. And so a wonderful example of being able to possibly do this is hiring somebody within a staff that makes this explicit. So sitting down with teammates, sitting down with players and telling them, hey, you're having to practice at 5 a.m. You're having to put in a lot of effort in the weight room. You're having to memorize a lot of different plays. You're having to study a lot of different film. Those are amazing attributes that you can implement into school or education as well. Getting up early to study, putting in effort and going to class, using your memorization skills to memorize anatomy or different questions within your textbooks, using your studying skills of analyzing film to analyze a book or a PowerPoint or a lecture. Amazing skills that can be developed within sport and physical activity, but unfortunately aren't made explicit. They think that players should just transfer these so-called skills and strategies when in reality, coaches and staff aren't making that known. And I think that's a problem in sport. I think that needs to be addressed. That's all I have for you. I know I went like 8 or 9 minutes over what I said, but hopefully that was helpful. I think this is an amazing chapter. It's very interesting. I think it's a little bit different from just some of the other sports psych and exercise psych stuff that we talk about. And it's one reason why we wanted to include it. Because I feel that a lot of these tenets and concepts can apply to not only this class and in bettering yourself as a student within this class, but outside this class as well. And that's really my intention with this whole class in general, is taking these concepts of sport and exercise psychology and applying them to your life as an athlete, as a student, in relationships, as a professional. So that's all I have. Thanks. Hope you found some use in this. God bless you.